1901, and the visit to New Zealand of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York is recorded on film. This footage is the oldest surviving fragment of film shot in New Zealand, but over the years, Kiwis took to the art of the cinema with passion and ingenuity, and filmmakers recorded moments of our history and national life which now stand as permanent records of days gone by. Almost 90 years later, scores of these film fragments of our past were gathered from the vaults of the New Zealand Film Archive and the libraries of Television New Zealand to make a series of minute-long TVNZ programs which New Zealanders took to their hearts. The program is ANZ Magic Minutes, and here are 60 of the best. 1935, and New Zealanders hear themselves in a big screen feature for the first time. It's the first Kiwi talkie down on the farm. Hollywood talkies were an international sensation, but the technology behind them was a closely guarded secret.
Oi, Cookie! Well, what do you want now? Hurry up, I'm busy.
To capture these scenes, soundman Jack Welsh had to invent his own talkie system.
All right, I'll have one later.
And it worked.
Goodbye, Cookie.
Now, Mr. Hopkins.
Appalling it may be by today's standards, but in 1935, it was do-it-yourself movie magic. There's always been a quid in looking after the housewife. It's hard to imagine it now, but there was a time when supermarkets were new.
The customer takes a trolley or basket and just helps herself to what she wants. Supermarkets are a popular feature of American life, and if the New Zealand public likes the idea, stores modelled on them may soon become established in this country.
We didn't invent the supermarket, but we have had our domestic pioneers.
This travelling washing machine service is run by Mrs. Watson, who calls at your home, unloads a washing machine, and gets to work. Able to do several washes in one day, this service seems to be the answer to the busy housewife's problems. Mrs. Watson is not one to tarry, and no sooner is the wash done than she's away, and another wash will be done before lunchtime.
And for the men, there was always rugby. 1905, and the legendary New Zealand rugby team of that time walks out against a Welsh club side in what is the first ever European tour by the first team ever called the All Blacks. They toured North America, France and Britain, and were undefeated until they got to the test in Wales, which they lost 3-0. The British press dubbed them the All Blacks because that was the colour they played in. But Dave Gallagher's 1905 All Blacks started a legend and began a feud with the men of Wales, which endures to this day. But we also had our pop stars. Some survive to this day. Ray Columbus. When the swinging 60s hit New Zealand, the beat music, the suits, and the convulsive gyrations were all borrowed from Britain. But the young man under the mop top was Kiwi Ray Columbus, and the girl he was singing about became an Australasian sensation. With the Invaders, Ray had smash hits and wild concerts, and one night in Perth, they had to play She's a Mod 9 times.
She's a mod, she's a mod, yeah, yeah, she's a mod, she's a mod. She won't drink anymore.
If she's still a mod, she's in her 40s now, but for a whole generation, she's the sound of the 60s. And Dinah Lee, she was a mod. Dinah Lee, she put a Kiwi face on the swinging 60s.
Baby, baby, oh my baby, oh baby, baby, oh my baby, cat with the beat, do the boogie woogie in the middle of it. Hello, baby, hello, baby.
The hair said London, her clothes said somewhere else, but she had a string of hits both here and across the Tasman with songs like Don't You Know Yokomo and Reet Petite. And everyone, except Dinah's baby, was doing the blue beat.
My baby, he just can't do the blue beat. Yeah, my baby, he just can't do the blue beat.
No mountain was too high for Hillary. Edmund Percival Hillary, When he climbed to the top of Everest on May 29, 1953, his life changed forever. He and Sherpa Tenzing had climbed where no man had climbed before, and it made Hillary perhaps the most famous New Zealander of all, and probably the most unassuming.
And I said, well, George, we knocked the bastard off.
He had left New Zealand a shy beekeeper and returned Sir Edmund Hillary, hero.
Edmund Hillary and George Lowe emerged to report all's well to the men and women who in spirit were never far behind them.
It was a present for the Queen on the eve of her coronation. It was a British expedition, but we knew it was a Kiwi who'd stood on top of the world. Then our eyes turned from Everest to Westminster.
On this day, not only in all parts of the British Commonwealth and Empire, but also among many friends elsewhere, minds and hearts are turning to Westminster Abbey.
Wellington, June 1953. While Britons held street parties or crowded around their TVs and wirelesses, Britain's most distant colony celebrated Coronation Day with as much pomp and ceremony as it could muster. But for New Zealand, there was double cause for celebration.
Attended by representatives of the city and the nation, Sir Willoughby Norrie takes the salute in honour of the Queen. Honour which seems very personal when the news of Sir Edmund Hillary's achievement comes through.
It was the beginning of the Anzac story. Wellington, October 1914, and 8,500 Kiwi soldiers prepare to sail into World War I. Within 6 months, they will be immortalised as the Anzacs in a tragic encounter with the Turks at Gallipoli. More than 2,700 Kiwis will die in the campaign. But on this spring day, war was still an adventure to young men leaving home for the first time. They imagined they were headed to France to fight the Germans. Instead, they were shipped to Egypt to train alongside the Australians in preparation for the bloody assault that is commemorated as Anzac Day. While our men helped fight the Second Great War, we opened our doors. November 1, 1944. 700 Polish children arrived from war-torn Europe to a new life in New Zealand. They'd been invited here by Prime Minister Peter Fraser.
Many are orphans, many are motherless. Few know if their fathers are still alive. The little girls and the shaven-headed boys touch the hearts of the New Zealand people. The train takes them on the last leg of a long journey to Pahiatua Camp, where they're to stay for a time. Why did these children come here? What is their story? They were the innocent victims of aggression.
In the 30s, the state became more caring. The kids got milk. 1937, and coming out of the Depression, New Zealand is the first country in the world to introduce free school milk.
And milk is now available to 160,000 children, and the scheme being extended as rapidly as possible.
The scheme is brought in by the first Labour government to prevent undernourishment in primary school children. And those were the days when if you were really good, you got to be a milk monitor.
Here's a delightful and typical scene. Never has any previous government looked after the children so well, and never were parents less anxious for their future.
School kids had 30 years of slurping milk through straws before the scheme was abandoned in better nourished times during the 60s. Whatever the sport, we wanted to be the best. Mark Todd and charisma. They'd won equestrian gold at the Los Angeles Olympics, but could they win again at Seoul? They easily won the dressage and the cross country. But show jumping isn't their best event, and charisma is now 16 years
I
old.
said, aren't you a bit worried about his age? Nobody told Charisma he's old. And he's clear over that. He can do what he likes with these last two. It really doesn't matter. It's Todd for two and two for Todd.
Oh, it's great.
Mark Todd and Charisma, the first time since 1932 that one horse and rider have won the Olympic gold medal for the three-day event in two successive Olympic Games, and it was a Kiwi who does it.
New Zealand and ANZ, 150 years young. We were also ready to accept change. The 10th of July 1967, the day we swapped pounds, shillings and pence for dollars and cents.
The 10th of July next year.
Halfpennies, pennies, threepences, sixpences, shillings, florins, half-crowns and pounds were gone forever. And the chief architect of the changeover was a young Under-Secretary for Finance called Rob Muldoon.
We've been doing our best to make the public feel that it's not going to be too bad, but I'm sure there'll be public apprehension up until the time of the changeover. And after that, people will be saying, well, what were we worrying about?
And he was right. Kiwis quickly took a shine to their new coinage.
Oh, I think the changeover should have occurred years ago.
But some things didn't change.
And look at the great big
The Saturday night dance, a magic moment at the end of the week for Kiwis growing up in the 50s and 60s.
I had a shatish with a tart from the butcher's, had a waltz with the constable's wife, had the beer from the keg on the cream truck, and the cop had one too, you can bet your life. Oh, it's great being out with the jokers, when the jokers are sparking and bright. Yeah, it's great giving cheek to the Sheilas down the hall on Saturday night.
They were irresistible and eligible, the American GIs. Young Kiwi women were keen on them. Young Kiwi men weren't so sure. But when 100,000 American soldiers came to New Zealand during World War II, they brought excitement with their jazz music and their inscrutable brand of football.
In fitting for the traditional Army mule, a donkey introduces football American fashion to Auckland. The kickoff. This is about the only time you ever see the ball in this game. The big crowd tries hard to follow the play, but only millions of Americans can understand it. Well, fashions come and fashions go, but we still like the game they play on Eden Park or Carisbrook every Saturday afternoon.
Early this century, our pioneering spirit got us through. The Buller Gorge, 1910. For the first 2 decades of this century, the main form of road transport was stagecoach. In 1909, for instance, there were only 4 motor cars on the west coast. One traveller wrote that the road through the Buller was a nightmare. It was narrow, winding and sheer, with zigzag roads cut into rock. But if the traveller had the nerve or stomach to take in the view, the scenery was breathtakingly beautiful. Some of our biggest feats were on the rugby field. It was the day Kirky scored his greatest try. It's been called one of the greatest solo tries ever made by an All Black. It was against the Lions, Lancaster Park, 1971.
The corner flag was sort of not that far away, 50 metres away, which might sound a long way, but it's not that far. I just put my ears back and went for it, you know.
Still going. Fends one off on the right. On the left. Still going. And the crowd are just going wild. Tremendous try. Ian Kirkpatrick from Poverty Bay.
It was just one of 50 tries Ian Kirkpatrick scored for the All Blacks, but Lancaster Park was his greatest. Even off the rugby field, our men were great movers. In 1949, they didn't build bodies as big, but they could certainly move their muscles.
The title of Mr. New Zealand was awarded to Eddie Horton for best all-round physical condition and posture. And his Whangarei teammate Keith Going, winner of 2 special awards, gave a demonstration of muscle control. Eddie Horton did something along the same lines with his shoulder blades.
However, the women's togs of the time left a little more to the imagination.
The highly qualified judges give their verdict, and the winner is decked out with a sash and declared Miss Aotearoa for 1949.
There were other women who put their beauty to dance. Rowena Jackson. She danced her way from Invercargill to Covent Garden. Principal dancer with the Royal Ballet from 1954 to 1959. She was our first international ballerina. She was renowned for her lyrical interpretation of the classics and also her technical skill. In 1959, she toured New Zealand with the Royal Ballet, along with fellow New Zealand dancer Alexander Grant and new husband and dance partner Philip Chatfield. The same year, she returned home to teach and to inspire another generation of would-be ballerinas. Back in the back blocks, Bill Hamilton was at work. Charles William Fielder Hamilton, our brilliant inventor from the back blocks. From his workshop at Irishman Creek in the Mackenzie country, Bill Hamilton set out to go on water where no man had gone before.
Special centrifugal pump which feeds the jet.
The boat fulfilled its inventor's dream of a machine which could explore the shallow, fast-flowing rivers of the South Island. The Hamilton jet was his dream come true, and the whole world got the benefit.
And so there he goes against more currents than one, an outstanding industrialist and inventor, whose choice it is to live far from the cities, through the snowy winters and dry summers of the remote Mackenzie Plains.
Even at war, there's still the washing.
Of course, it's so much easier with a washing machine, and this New Zealander built his own. All he has to do is pop in his clothes and put the lid on them. He probably doesn't like washing his dirty linen in public. A little energy on the end of the handle does the job. But his ingenuity didn't stop with a washing machine. He built a wringer too, and it works perfectly. Well, it works. Just another example of the resource and skill of a typical New Zealander. He can well be proud of the 1,001 things washed by his own hands in his own machine. Well-made New Zealand.
It wasn't quite the sport of kings, but our soldiers made do. It was the day they raced the donkeys in the desert.
Not altogether a second Ellerslie, but if there's no tote, it won't be missed. Picking winners from these is certainly a gamble, but when it comes to horseflesh, New Zealanders are more at home. It's fun for the riders, and it's fun for the backers. Yes, the donkeys have had bad news. They're down for the next race. It's only 30 yards. Well, you try running 30 yards with a hefty New Zealander on your back.
Back home, they were rearing the real thing. Cardigan Bay, he was the world's greatest pacer. By the time he'd finished racing, old Cardi had etched his name into the memories of a generation of New Zealanders.
If you could make a recipe of a horse with stamina, speed, tractability, determination, everything, that was what would come out would be Cardigan Bay.
It's Cardigan Bay by 3/4 length from Robin Dundee in the middle of the race. He down on the inside and Ben the foot on the outside. But Cardigan Bay is here. Robin Dundee is catching Master Allen also. But they race past the most. That's Cardigan Bay is the winner.
He was so successful that in 1966, American officials wanted to bar him from the betting. He was a horse in a million. At the same time, New Zealand had a man in a million. Peter Snell. It was 1962, and this was the half-mile race the great miler thought was much more important than his world-mile record.
At the end of the first lap, Robinson is still in front. But as they go past the 4:40 mark, Snell is overtaking him and will go out into the number 1 position. He breasts the tape just 1 minute 45.4 seconds after leaving the starting line. Peter Snell has lowered the half-mile record by 1.7 seconds and the 800 metres by 2.4 seconds.
I feel personally that half-mile effort today rates better than that mile last Saturday. That's my attitude towards half-miling. I feel that there's just a little bit too much attention paid to this magic of the 4-minute mile.
New Zealand congratulates Peter Snell, one of the fastest men in the world.
Women could also fly. She was hailed as the Greater Garbo of our skies, and when Jean Batten landed at Mangere Aerodrome on October 16, 1936, it was the end of an historic flight.
Actually, today I'm just 10 days, 21 hours out from England. So in this flight, in which I considered the Tasman only the last half of the whole journey, I was able to fly through from England to New Zealand in the fastest time in the history of the world, and also to make the fastest flight ever between the two dominions, Australia and New Zealand. Well, I don't need to add how pleased I am to see you all here to greet me. And I think I can say without doubt, this is the very greatest moment of my life.
The men at home held the fort. The Home Guard. While the young men were at war and women were running the farms and factories, the Home Guard was learning how to make do with captured machine guns, shooting practice firing a shotgun at a sheep's carcass, and bombs made by filling jam tins with 5-inch nails. They were serious and thorough.
Hidden men in camouflage suits stop a dummy tank with a landmine and plaster it with their Molotov firebombs.
In the end, they weren't needed, but they were ready to fight for us on the beaches.
If after that there is any fight still left in the tank crew, it's knocked out of them with Tommy guns.
50 years later, the menace on the beaches was Humphrey. 1987, and Humphrey the amorous sea elephant makes headlines around the world when he lumbers onto a Coromandel farm and starts courting the cows. Content with his cows, Humphrey is not happy with any attempts to relocate him, and there are very few people who will argue with 2 tons of blubber.
Now, come on, this way.
Finally, he has to face up to the fact that an electric fence has come between him and his heartthrobs, and it's time to head back to the beach. Humphrey's become a familiar sight in the Coromandel, and the locals are just as smitten with him as he once was with a couple of Coromandel cows. To be old was to be special. Mrs. Parewahawaha Ranganui Leonard was the oldest living person in the Commonwealth. She celebrated her 111th birthday on September 23, 1984, surrounded by 6 generations of her family. She smoked a pipe at 12 and was 13 when Mount Tarawera erupted in 1886. Her father was from the Rakawa tribe, and she was born in the heart of the Waikato. She was a direct descendant of Tarapraha, which probably explains her fierce, independent spirit. As an only child, she liked being the center of attention. In 1985, she died, aged 112. We'd always loved royalty, but the Queen's mother was someone special. She was everyone's favorite mum, and we gave her a big welcome when she finally came here in 1966.
The Queen Mother came to pay us the visit she had to cancel 2 years earlier when she was indisposed. From Bluff, she went to Invercargill, Central Otago, and the Lakes. This was the picture that possibly caught our imaginations more than any other. A lovely setting and a queen in gumboots and pearl necklace. A royal visit certainly wouldn't be the same without Maori entertainers, and her hosts at Rotorua put on a magnificent display for her.
Her hats were famous. She earned our affection. The Queen's mum seemed like everybody's. It wasn't America, but the Kiwi cowboys were just as tough. In 1949, while John Wayne was galloping across the silver screen, Kiwis were developing their own kind of cowboy.
At Miami, the Young Farmers Club stages a rodeo in true Wild West style. As some of the meanest man-killers in the province are turned loose, hard-riding bronco busters of all ages, sexes, and capabilities experience some of the ups and downs of life. Here comes another bull-ring bruiser. It's a toss-up which is shaken off first, his head or himself. He loses. There's no bull about this. It's a girl on a steer, and believe me, she's steering for disaster. This is something revolutionary in bull ring tactics. He's obviously trying to get the rider giddy. For a rough and tough sport, there's nothing to touch the rodeo. Ride 'em, cowboy.
Our women were formidable leaders too. Mabel Howard, the first woman cabinet minister in the Commonwealth.
By my father.
4'11" and formidable, Mabel Howard was a fighter for what she called the bottom dog in society, and a legend for waving a pair of bloomers in Parliament.
The new Parliament will bring to light many points of great political interest, and included in the Cabinet is the new Minister of Health, Miss Mabel Howard.
The opening of Parliament has brought home to me very forcibly the great honour that has been done to the women of New Zealand
by my appointment to cabinet rank. In the fields of health and education, women are strongly represented, and they have made a valuable contribution to our national development.
New Zealand and ANZ, 150 years young. In a country full of sheep, shearing became a national sport. Godfrey Bowen, champion shearer and showman. He developed a method which produced unblemished fleeces, and he was fast. In January 1953, he broke the world shearing record.
Nearly 5:30 now, and Godfrey's hobby of shearing sheep is almost over for the day. This is the last one, number 456. Bowen has beaten the record by 47 sheep, and during the day dropped about 2 tons of wool on the floor for his cobber to pick up, over 1,000 pounds worth. 447, 450, 453, 456. But there'll be no need for the new champion to count sheep to get some sleep tonight. Congratulations, Godfrey.
During the Depression, people thought small. 1933, and even the Great Depression couldn't stop the Kiwi do-it-yourselfer.
Here's just the bike for hard times. Mr. Jack Gibbons of Only Hung at Auckland made this in his spare time, and it took 8 weeks to do. There are overhead valves, twin ports, and twin exhaust pipes. In fact, if he'd only made 2 of them, they'd be just the thing for the twins. It has all the latest conveniences: dynamo lighting, pressed steel frame, Peyton forks, hot and cold running water, 2 bed and 1 reception. I'm sorry, I got onto the wrong catalogue there. Anyhow, it runs 400 miles to the gallon, can do 40 miles per hour, has a 2-speed gearbox, and on 1 pint of oil can do 1,000 miles. And anyhow, if you want to walk home from the motorbike rides, you can pick it up and take it with you.
35 years later, pop music was the latest fad. The Chicks, Judy and Sue Donaldson. 2 mini-skirted sisters from Huapai who took the 60s teen scene by storm.
I remember what I said, now I'm going out of my head. I wonder if one day that you'll see that you care. If you say you love me madly, I'll gladly be there like a puppet on a string.
They weren't quite the Supremes, just a couple of local girls in the latest gear. But Kiwi teenagers followed their every change of clothes. Long before television, we had our radio stars. Aunt Daisy. She was a legend in New Zealand radio for nearly 30 years.
Well, good morning, everybody. Here I am.
Women loved her homemaking hints and common sense advice. She visited the United States loaded with Kiwi advice and returned singing the praises of good old New Zealand.
Back again in New Zealand, which is the very easiest country in the world to live in and work in at the present time, I can assure you of
Not
that.
surprisingly, both political parties chased her to run for Parliament, but the diminutive Daisy stuck to broadcasting. She delivered her last words on the radio just a few days before her death in 1963.
School concerts.
By then, she'd become everyone's Aunt Daisy.
Well, good morning, everybody.
The new bridge was an Auckland sensation. The day they opened the Harbour Bridge. It was the 30th of May 1959 and 106,000 people turned up.
Driving into the Northcote Toll Plaza, the Governor-General Lord Cobham arrives to perform the opening ceremony. The harbour bridge being more or less nautical, the Navy provides the guard of honour. At the end of the bridge, there's a big toll gate, and all the drivers that go through there have to pay the man some money. First day's toll takings total £5,000. 51,000 vehicles have passed through the booths. 4 years after construction began, the Auckland Harbour Bridge is open for business.
Before the bridge, Auckland's North Shore barely existed. It was the bridge that changed a city. It was country and western, Kiwi style.
Rosin the bow, and here we go.
There were 6 of them. 3 school teachers, a draftsman, a student of anthropology, and a bus mechanic. Together, they were the Hamilton County Bluegrass Band. And in the late 60s, while everyone else was into the Beatles and flower power, they became a Kiwi country and western sensation.
Kick that old town out of the way and watch that fighting goose.
Howdy, neighbor, howdy, get out and come right in. will make a bowl of pretty, stuff your biscuits in. Pour a pot of coffee and make me in. Look it out, country hand, feet on your neck.
Before the age of the jetliner, there were boats that flew. They could fly, they could float. They were the new solid flying boats, and in Wellington, 1950, the flying boat to Sydney was the way to go.
Wellington sees a new aircraft when the Solent flying boat Ararangi uses Evans Bay as a landing and takeoff area. The Solent has been developed specially for long non-stop travel, and from every angle meets every need of passenger service.
By 1952, the airline Teal had carried almost 40,000 passengers on the 7-hour crossings from Auckland and Wellington. But 2 years later, the flying boats were gone, replaced by Douglas DC-6s, which did the trip in a mere 5 hours. In the 1930s, we found that good health could hurt. Kids called it the murder house, but the first Labour government attacked Kiwi tooth decay with a huge increase in school dental clinics.
Good teeth mean good citizens. Watch how the youngsters almost enjoy it. Can they take it? Oh, I'll say. In November 1935, the number of student dental nurses was 53. At the present time, there are 140, an increase of 87. A very considerable number of these will shortly be available for work in the school dental clinics throughout the country.
By 1978, over 1,000 nurses had treated 500,000 New Zealand children, and the old views of dentistry as teeth-pulling torture were changing. But as late as the 50s, there was still a quite widespread belief that people were better off without their natural teeth. And then came the famous five, the Lawson twins: Samuel, Deborah, Selina, Shirlene and Lisa. He was an Auckland fish shop owner, and she became the most famous mother in New Zealand.
Proud parents Sam and Shirley Ann are no longer just plain Mr. and Mrs. Lawson. The multiple birth has thrown them into the dazzling glare of public interest. From now on, privacy is a luxury money won't buy.
The whole world wanted to see them and give them things.
One of the first gifts is a new car from a national grocery chain. A television set, blankets, mattresses. And hundreds of nappies. The flood continues.
The Lawsons. So famous, we just called them the Quins. Second Lieutenant Moana Nui Akiwa Narimu. He was the Maori battalion warrior from Ngāti Peru who won the Victoria Cross for his leadership of C Company's assault on a desert hill in 1943. It cost his life, and he became the first Maori VC.
8,000 Maoris and Pākehās have come to the ceremony. Today, tribal differences and old quarrels have been set aside. Lieutenant Ngarimu is regarded as belonging not to one tribe, but to the whole Maori people. After the ceremony, Mr. Ngarimu thanks the Maori people and the people of New Zealand for the honor.
Kia ora ngaiwi, I hui hui mai nei. Te whakanui tara o Moana Nui Akiwa. He loved this country so well that he was glad to fight for it.
We took a very special dolphin into our hearts. Opo, the friendly dolphin. He wasn't the first dolphin we'd taken into our hearts. Back in 1912, Pelorus Jack befriended New Zealanders down by Pelorus Sound. But when Opo came visiting in 1956, he became an international sensation and a New Zealand legend. They came from all over to see him. They even wrote a song about him.
Everybody loves him at old Poloni Bay. He's such fun for old and young. They all want him to stay. He's Opo the crazy dolphin. He's friendly as can be. If you should want to...
Opo died stranded on rocks, and we found he was a she. Crowds wept at her funeral. We'd known her for just a year. It was time to toughen up the townies. 1937, the King George V Memorial Appeal raised £176,000 to set up 5 permanent health camps. Weedy townies were treated to a dose of fresh air, sunshine and toothbrushing.
Children's health camps placed throughout the Dominion will be an ever-living memory to the people of New Zealand of the name of King George V. The purpose of the health camps is not to cure disease in children, but to prevent it by building their reserves of health and fitness. We want more of these camps. and for the children's sake, and for New Zealand's good, we're going to have them.
New Zealand was doing good down on the farm too. We've always been the greatest little country per head of population in the world, even when it comes to pigs.
Fame has come to this New Zealand pig, Barnum Verna of Pukekohe. She's the mother of the world record litter of 19 piglets. Keeping an eye on 19 babies was a bit too much for Verna. She rolled on 2, and then there were 17. In an exclusive interview, Verna said, "Thank you, Verna, and now it's time to give the children the air."
And the broadcaster of the day couldn't resist finishing with a few appalling piggy puns.
Yes, Verna certainly brought home the bacon. It's not bad for a ham. She couldn't have been any rasher.
We needed houses, and the government saw that we got them. They were the houses that Jack built, a tribute to the Labour Housing Minister John A. Lee, and to a building scheme that would change the way New Zealanders lived.
This is the largest state house in the Dominion. Everybody else in the street thought that the government was putting up a new school or a theatre until they saw Mr. and Mrs. Hall and their extra XOS family of 12 move in. Mrs. Hall has a lot of room now, and for the first time in her life has a real stove to call her own. She can now provide many extra delicacies for her family.
It's easy to forget now, but after the Depression of the 30s, for many Kiwis, a state house meant luxury.
This was a great day, the opening of the first government scheme dwelling. Everybody is happy.
Even royalty was impressed by our state houses. It was the 1950 Ideal Home Show in London, and New Zealand had a very special exhibit, a brand new state house.
The typical New Zealand state house, exhibited by the New Zealand government and representatives of our primary industries. A distinguished visitor to the house was Princess Elizabeth, who was met by Mr. Jordan, New Zealand High Commissioner in London. Every room was inspected by Her Royal Highness, who was impressed by the large windows and general airiness of the place. And, of course, the Princess showed a particular interest in the kitchen and dining arrangements, strictly the women's department in any house.
It was a sporting answer to a cry for help. 1988, and reigning world squash champion, our own Susan Devoy, decides to walk the length of New Zealand to raise money for muscular dystrophy.
I think this first week will be the hardest because, you know, it's a week of solid walking like that when really I haven't done anything like that before. So, you know, it's going to be hard. You know, it's a serious walk, but we're going to have a lot of fun.
Everywhere she went, crowds turned out to see her, encourage her, and give her money. She ended up raising $250,000 and showing us all she's a champion with compassion. It was the Bonnie Babies' chance to put on a show. It was the New Zealand Industries Fair in Christchurch, 1947. But the most popular exhibit seemed to be 130 babies.
What New Zealand makes New Zealand. There were 130 starters in this event, which was held during the fair. It was Christchurch's biggest baby show yet. Here they are, the winners themselves, and all girls. First prize was a tubular steel folding pram designed by a new Plymouth man specially for carriage on trams and buses. Never mind, you'll be Miss New Zealand one day.
Some of our beauties were a little more grown up. The clothes are a bit different and our idea of beauty has changed a little. But in 1949, we made an even bigger fuss of Miss New Zealand than we do today.
Until Miss Scanlon announces Miss Mary Woodward of Taranaki as Miss New Zealand of 1949. Chosen from 13 girls in New Plymouth and a further 13 in Wellington, Miss Woodward will leave New Zealand on the 13th of July. 13 must bring her luck, so we send her a baker's dozen of good wishes. On behalf of the Prime Minister, Mr. Nash offers his congratulations. He seems very happy in his task.
It's a great honor to be chosen as Miss New Zealand for 1949, and I assure you that I'll do my very best to do honor to our country while I'm away.
Even the Kiwi men were unbeatable. the 1924 All Blacks. They toured Great Britain, France and Canada, and no one could beat them. So they were known as the Invincibles. The tour score, 32 matches won, 838 points scored with only 116 against. The manager was Stan Dean, the captain was Cliff Porter, and the team included all-time greats such as Bert Cook and George Napier, who played in every match as fullback, aged only 19. The Invincibles. If rugby wasn't our #1 sport when they left, it certainly was by the time they returned. We had novel ways of getting rid of pests. There was a time when the biggest problem we seemed to face was an invasion of wasps.
They can sting repeatedly,
but
and the pain is
resourceful
more severe
Kiwis
than the bees.
managed to make a quid out of it.
It's thought that queen wasps were carried here by airplane from overseas towards the end of the war. And in 1946, the Department of Agriculture instituted control measures. 10% DDT powder was later tried and found successful, and this was made available free of charge to the public, and they were shown how to use it. In 1948, a bounty of 3d each was offered for queen wasps during the hibernation period. Queues lined up at the wasp control office with the kill. This boy made nearly 80 pounds at 3d a crack. Better proposition than collecting bottles.
New Zealand and ANZ, 150 years young. In wartime, even the essentials were hard to come by. Wartime meant sacrifice, for the women at home too, and life's little luxuries had to go.
Silk stockings mean much in a woman's life, and rightly so, in the piping days of peace. But these are not the days of peace. Attractive as they may be, silk stockings are not essentials. But life will go on without them. Substitutes will be found. But aeroplane fabric and parachutes are essentials of modern war. The silk that went for other things now helps pave the road for victory. The women of New Zealand are making a substantial contribution to the national welfare by uncomplainingly doing without silk stockings and other non-essentials. Those who believe that in the midst of the most frightful war in the world's history, civilian life can remain untroubled and unchanged are living in a fool's paradise.
We've always had an eye for the ponies. November 1947, and everybody is off to the trots at Addington.
The crowds pile up as the 4-day cup meeting gets underway. And from the way the tote's sticking over, it looks as though the punters are laying it on with a will. Not a bad bet. And there's a man who's putting it on all round. Listen who's talking. The balloon's up, the barrier's down, and they're fighting it out on the rails all the way. Coming down to the straight, who is it? It's Congo Song. Congo Song bowling along from Gay Night, hanging on well, and Demetrius fighting it out. But Congo Song holds the lead as the field goes down to the post, and Congo Song will win 3 lengths out from Gay Night in the Metropolitan Challenge Stakes. 3 wins for Congo Song in 3 days. As Confucius says, if you're not in, you can't win. So we stick another pin through the old book and try again.
In the 60s, pirates were making waves on New Zealand radio.
You're listening to Radio Hauraki, top of the
The
dial,
Tiri,
and we're
a pirate ship which changed broadcasting history. From international waters, the Hauraki pirates took on state radio. October 23, 1966, and the police have orders to stop the Tiri sailing from Auckland. But 2,000 Hauraki supporters crowd the Western Viaduct as the pirates prepare to run the police blockade. Authorities try to lower the drawbridge, but fans stage a sit-in and the bridge stays up. With some onshore help, the Tiri breaks free, but the police launch catches up. The Hauraki pirates go to jail, but they've won a moral victory. Private radio is on the way. In the 20s, our aviation heroes ruled the air. September 11, 1928, Captain Charles Kingsford Smith lands the Southern Cross at Wigram Aerodrome, Christchurch, and becomes the first pilot to cross the Tasman. Smithy's flight captured the public imagination, and 35,000 New Zealanders greeted the Fokker monoplane when it landed at Wigram. The flight had been a marathon 14 hours and 25 minutes, and they'd flown blind through a series of violent storms. Compared to modern aircraft, the Southern Cross was just a primitive wing powered by 3 engines. But to the Christchurch locals who greeted her, she was the space shuttle of her time. And there were always gadgets to help the farmer.
Try and paint the aerial
For farmers, it was too good to be true. Someone had invented the radio-controlled sheepdog.
That's right. Bit fast, bit fast. Slower. Yeah, just a wee bit slower.
It was one of Country Calendar's notorious hoaxes, but animal lovers fell for it hook, line and electrode and complained that new technology was cruel.
Drop. Forward.
Of course, farmers had a few more clues and saw the story for what it was, a classic Kiwi leg pull.
No, careful. You're playing with it now. Well, what do you think of the apparatus?
Looks pretty good to me. First time I've ever had a totally obedient dog.
For our soldiers, it was a Christmas with a difference. Europe 1944, and for many Kiwi soldiers, it was their first white Christmas. They were foreigners a long way from home, but when it came to Christmas, they still did things the Kiwi way.
The first step in turning pig into pork, and for the onlookers, quite a cheering sight. Bringing home the wine is... Having given a good account of the turkey hunt, it's time to cut the cackle and get on with the job. Tomorrow will be a lovely day. Christmas dinner is now on at Div headquarters, and General Sir Bernard Freyberg comes to see the traditional ceremony of the officers serving the men. Thanks to the good organization and teamwork, this feed will be remembered for months to come. It's done a lot to make 1944 a memorable Christmas.
Back at home, our soldiers were being entertained too.
You didn't want it when you could have had it. You never used to miss it till today. And even if you had it, I don't suppose you'd like it, so you're better off without it anyway.
Gracie Fields. She was a wartime sweetheart the world over, and at the height of her fame as the war in Europe was ending, she paid her Kiwi fans a visit.
What Gracie thinks of the steam and the sulphur, she tells us later. But like everyone else, she's fascinated by the mud pools.
Now, what do you think the sulphur springs did to my beautiful hair? I started out this morning nice and curly, but there's not a bit left after walking down those sulphur springs.
After years of war, the cheeky lass from Lancashire reminded us we could still laugh. Everybody turned out to see our new Queen for the first time. January 1954, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh tour New Zealand. It's the first time a reigning monarch has set foot on New Zealand soil.
Matamata County thrills to the simple friendliness of the Queen.
School children are issued with flags to wave, usually Union Jacks. And in Rotorua, the royal couple are greeted by 60,000 and a Maori welcome.
The first challenge is made by a chief of the Tuwharetoa tribe. A second challenge is now delivered. The challenger, Ananania Amohau, the Arawa chief who wrote the Maori Battalion's marching song.
She's been here several times since, but there's never been anything like the fervour the young Queen faced in the royal tour of 54. Even our mail service got the royal seal of approval. 1940, and the Royal Mail Service takes to the sky.
A Royal Mail airliner ran to Brongatai Airport. Mails which had been rushed out by motor car are loaded. To obtain equalization of weight in the plane, the nose and wing compartments are used. The schoolboy with his youthful writings. The elderly lady with weekly letter to her distant son. The man concerned with practical matters of business. The little child corresponding with Father Christmas. The soldier writing home from camp. Your post office, a part of the biggest business organization in the world, is at your beck and call, hourly, daily, throughout the year. For but a few pence, your letter holds the key to the Royal Mail Services.
Linda Jones. By January the 22nd, 1979, she had turned the male racing fraternity upside down. But this would be Linda's biggest day. The race was the Wellington Derby, and Linda was riding Holy Toledo. It had been a long struggle, but Linda had beaten the odds and pioneered race riding for New Zealand women. Then she took on the Australian authorities and became the first woman to ride and win a race across the Tasman.
And to win a race here has been tremendous because, you know, you've got the best riders in the world and the best people.
Linda was a winner on and off the track. We honoured the bravery of our war heroes, Keith Elliott and Charles Upham. The desert soldiers of 1941 who became two of New Zealand's most celebrated war heroes.
For bravery in the field, the Victoria Cross for Lieutenant Upham on the left.
It was the first of Upham's two VCs. They were two Kiwi men just doing their duty.
To Sergeant Keith Elliott, veteran of Greece, Crete and Libya, went the VC. At Ruwezat, Sergeant Elliott led his 19 men in a desperate rearguard action, silencing 5 machine gun posts and capturing 130 prisoners, despite being wounded 4 times himself. But the VC was not the only recognition of the bravery of this farmer from Mangomari. His portrait by the official war artist will be added to New Zealand's Gallery of Heroes.
Back at home, the women were doing their bit. The Women's Land Service was formed in 1940 to relieve the wartime shortage of farm labour. Recruitment was slow at first, but then women were offered incentives such as uniforms, gumboots and stockings. By 1944, there were more than 2,000 of them, and we called them the Land Girls.
My friend and I took over this farm a year ago. We'd had 12 months training, and here we still work under the direction of the supervisor, who visits us often. We've got 300 acres and we run about 1,100 sheep. Both of us have always been keen on country life, so we started doing our bit in this war by working on the land. Now we've got this place on our own. Grand.
Some women took to more feminine pursuits. Miss New Zealand 1961. Beauty contests were in their heyday, and modern feminism had yet to reach our shores.
5 anxious girls, outwardly composed and exposed, offer themselves to the extremely critical gaze of the audience and the judges. The judges note the finer points from every angle. They're not allowed to touch these offerings, though. This is it. A decision has been made, and Joe Brown hands the vital information to the Mayor of Dunedin, who will proclaim the winner. Leonie Mann of Auckland becomes Miss New Zealand 1961. Kia ora, Leonie, and may your personality and vital statistics bring you further success as Miss New Zealand 1961.
The Americans sent us a very special ambassador.
Wheeling in comes this Liberator bomber, bringing Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt on her first visit to New Zealand. Her visit is a pleasant surprise, but all New Zealand is ready to welcome the distinguished wife of the President of the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt is here to visit American forces, and she will see something of the war work of our women. New Zealand is honored to welcome this pleasant personality.
Many of the women at home would like, I think, to send a message to the women of New Zealand, because so many of our boys have been stationed here that they know already how hospitable and kind the women of this country have been to the sons and husbands and brothers of the women in the United States.
From our television screens came a rural sensation. Country Calendar. Some thought it was purely for the farmers, but sometimes it was the funniest show on TV. Of course, townies didn't always know they were having their legs pulled. Country Calendar played it straight. Some laughed, some were taken in, but we were all talking about Country Calendar. Out at sea, we took to fishing. The Bay of Islands, 1927, and a deep-sea fishing expedition sets off for a day's sport. Just a year before, American novelist Zane Grey had immortalised New Zealand as the Angler's El Dorado. What he'd called virgin waters were now internationally acclaimed as some of the greatest big game fishing grounds in the world. And with catches of up to 7 or 8 monster marlin a day, who could argue? You can't beat a great Kiwi sense of humour. The turkey in gumboots, a cheeky hoax pulled by the 60s TV programme Town and Around.
The particular bird we've been having a close look at is wearing a man's size 8 gumboot.
Do you find that black is the most satisfactory colour for all the birds?
No, we don't. We found that black is not attractive, especially on the female birds.
Is the female bird not attracted to the male because of the plain black colour?
That's right. We found that the attraction is not there, so this season we're going into pastel shades.
This would be pinks and blues and creams and even heliotrope, I suppose.
Yes, as long as they're a fairly bright pastel shade.
At last, the fighting was over.
And the war in Europe has ended.
VE Day, victory in Europe. It was the day New Zealand had a huge party.
The whistles have blown, the bells have rung, the bands are playing. The war in Europe is over.
It was a party to end all parties, but when the party was over, there was still work to be done.
Most of our bombers and fighters are now on their way to the Far East. We'll soon get an even worse taste than what we gave to the Hun.
And a very special band of soldiers returned home. The war was over and the celebrated warriors of the Maori Battalion were finally home. 650 didn't come back, but for the survivors, it was a homecoming like no other.
Here at Ngāroa Wahia, the arrival of the train bringing home the men is marked by little activity, but their people are waiting for them on the marae. Men of the Maori Battalion are home.
We welcomed home our heroes from the war.
I want to say how darn glad I am to be back in little old NZ.
1945, and a generation separated by war were at last together again. The New Zealand the boys had come home to was changing. We were heading for the prosperous 50s and the post-war baby boom. New Zealand and ANZ, 150 years young.